To Radical Engagement here at Varn Blog, and we continue our walk through the first section of the Marxist Unity Group Reader, which in this case is the first chapter of Lars Lee's Lenin. We discovered what is to be done. Let's get straight into the text. I would also suggest you watch the prior two videos before watching this because you're in the middle of a text. Maybe you like that sort of thing. Nonetheless, we're going to get straight to it. So if you're following along on the bottom page of page 6 in the Mug Reader and their most recent edition. And this is largely. The great duty of taking political power implies the aim of all this inside an organization will be nationwide, class-based, and therefore an independent political party. Marx sketches the development of such a party in part 1 of the manifesto, although it's really the only place where he talks about it. One theme, well, I shouldn't say it's the only place. The other places are in letters, but it's one of the places where he publicly talked about it with something printed in his lifetime. One theme in this sketch is of a particular importance of understanding Lenin's rhetoric and what is to be done. The parallel Marx draws between nationalization of the economy and nationalization of political organizations. The bourgeoisie nationalizes the economy by dislodging it from its original starting point in the local, parochial, and scattered and low technology production, and progressively moves it to the endpoint of a national, urban, centralized, industrialized production. I mean, honestly, that isn't even the endpoint. It's a international industrial production. Now, that doesn't mean global, but it does mean international, and that's pretty much always been true. The bourgeois transformation of society is mirrored by the transformation of society's own political organizations. Thus, confrontations between the individual workers and the individual bourgeois increasingly take the character of compensation between two classes. The drive towards nationwide combination is furthered by the growing means of communication generated by large-scale industry that put workers of different localities in contact with one another, thus standardizing languages, et cetera, et cetera. You add that to the printing press and mass and the beginnings of mass communication, you can see how this would work. But this context is all that is needed to centralize the many local struggles of general similar kind into a national class struggle, and maybe even an international one. Thus, a merger formula sets socialists a task of organizing and propaganding on a national level. Well, it's more than that, Lars. I actually think you need to really deal with that. From this definition of the task flows in enormous tactical implications, the necessity of freedom of assembly, freedom of press, and other political freedoms. Something the left often forgets about. This implication is already drawn out without any ambiguity in the Communist Manifesto. As discussed earlier, the third section of the manifesto outlines the nature of the merger between socialism and the workers' movement in a negative form, showing how not to do it. In the third of the 5 targets attacked in the third section, Marx draws a contrast between the German true socialists and the German communists. As described by Marx, the true socialists were a set of intellectuals who hurled traditional anathemas against liberalism, against representative government, against bourgeois competition, bourgeois freedom of press, bourgeois right, bourgeois freedom and equity. These were like the Prussian socialists, like the ones that Spengler liked. These were some of the more anti-liberal parts of the German historical school. This is an interesting cluster of people. Even some Lassalleans would have fallen into this category. They were so eager to use socialist demands as a way of discrediting any striving for political freedom that they became the tools of the nobility and the German absolutist government. As we might say today, in many such cases, today as well. Far different are the German communists who fought alongside the bourgeoisie as soon as it showed itself revolutionary against the absolutist monarchy, the feudal landholders, the petty bourgeoisie. And this is specifically in 1848. But I do think we have to deal with where the bourgeois revolutionaries ended up, which is more covered by the Brumaire. We'll get back to that. Exactly these passages are cited by Plekhanov in Socialism and Political Struggle, the book he issued in 1883 to announce his conversion to social democracy. As Plekhanov's title implies, the aim of the book was to convince the Russian socialists, by here I'm assuming mostly the Narodniki, that the struggle for political freedom must be their utmost urgent priority. But the insistence on political freedom was not only to the Russian, but also to all social democrats. It was what distinguished the political strategy of Marx-based social democracy from other 19th century socialists, revolutionaries, and workers' movement activists, be they Louis Blanc socialists in France, or the Enragés in the French Revolution, or the Diggers and Levelers, maybe even parts of the Chartists, some various groups of anarchists, etc. The central importance of political freedoms for social democracy is brought out in another revealing but overlooked text by Engels, The Working Men of Europe in 1877, a text that I have not spent a lot of time with, I admit that. In this survey of the progress of workers' parties all over the continent, the state of political freedom is the touchstone of the aims and successes of the various national parties. Engels' description of the French worker class is particularly revealing. Why does he keep calling it worker class? But anyway, it's a weird formation. By 1877, the French worker class had suffered two recent traumas. The first was, quote, the 18 years of the Bonapartist empire, during which the press was fettered, the right of meeting and of a free association of the press, and the working class consequently deprived of every means of intercommunication and organization. This repressive regime was followed by the crushing of the Paris Commune in 1871. The ones who held power in France now were the very middle-class radicals, as Engels very angrily put it, who had betrayed the workers in the country. Nevertheless, Engels' political advice is to support these hateful bourgeois Democrats against monarchist attacks. The worker has, quote, but one immediate interest, to avoid the reoccurrence of another such protracted realm of repression as it experienced in the Bonapartism, for those of you who think Bonapartism is super great, and with it the necessity of again fighting, not only for their direct emancipation, but for the state of things permitting them to prepare for the final emancipatory struggle. Only the Republic, despicable as it was, gave them a chance to, quote, obtain a degree of personal liberty and public liberty, as will allow them to establish a working class and agitation by meeting and organization as an independent political party. And moreover, the conservation of the Republic would save the necessity of delivering separate battles to its future reconquest. Now, if people have a problem with this as this mere bourgeois freedoms, this is coming from Engels. Political freedoms are so fundamental that even the political independence should be temporary sacrifice for them if need be. Okay, this one's one that's going to be interesting. In 1877, the worker class supported the Republicans from attack by the monarchists. I think it's like Lee's almost shadow arguing with Bordigist here. But anyway, Engels comments, no doubt in this, they acted as the tail of the middle-class Republicans and radicals. But a working class which has no press, no meetings, no clubs, no political societies, what else can it be but the tail of the radical middle-class party? What can it do in order to gain the political independence, but to support the only party which is bound to secure the people generally, and therefore to the working man too, such liberties as will admit of independent organizations? Thus, a new view of history set out in the Communist Manifesto came attached to with a political strategy, one that is firmly outlined in the manifesto itself, and one to which the authors remain loyal over the years. Some writers see the contrast between the revolution of the address to the Communist League in 1850 with the reformist inaugural address to the Working Men's International Association in 1864. Yet both are based on the same fundamental political strategy: survive to attain political liberties and use them once attained to bring a combination of knowledge to the nationwide independent worker party, whose goal it is to conquer political power and introduce socialism, quote, worldwide. I do think Lee's being cagey here about the worldwideness of this, and I'm gonna despite the fierceness of cry de revolution in permanence, the cry de revolution in permanent, the permanent revolution, which, by the way, people think Trotskyists made that up or it's pure idealist nonsense. It comes from 1850. The 1850 address is engaged in giving electoral advice, quote, even where there is no prospect whatsoever of being elected, the workers put up their own candidates in order to preserve their independence, to count their forces and to bring before the public the revolutionary attitude and party standpoint. Note, their own candidates, not some bourgeois candidates, under the assumption of a lengthy revolutionary development. Despite the mildness of the inaugural address salute to the legislation, such as the English 10-hour bill, Marx still insisted to the great duty of the working class is to conquer political power in order to abolish hired labor. The Marx presented here is not the Marx of Les Kolakowski, who opens his trilogy what he considers to be the most important fact about Marx, namely, Marx was a German philosopher. Yeah, and he starts the history of Marxism with Plotinus, which, by the way, if you want to talk about dialectics, it goes back before Plotinus. It goes back to at least Plato and Aristotle. Dialectical argumentation also goes back in ancient India to Nagarjuna. And at least actually there's evidence of dialectics in Abhidharma, and Vedanta argumentation styles. Anyway, nor is it the marks of Jeff Ely, who writes Marx's most important legacy for the pre-1914 social democratic tradition was an economic theory that emphasized, quote, the determining effects of material forces on the human achievement and the linking of political opportunities to the movement of the economy. Which, yeah, I mean, this is the great battle against economism led by Lenin and people like Lee. I think Ellie's point, Ellie, is not totally out of nowhere, but I do think there is a linking of the material forces with the political economy, but it is not the solely determining link. In fact, it's a feedback loop, and quote, only in the last instance, unquote. Nor yet is it the marks of Eric Hobsbawm, who says Marx's greatest impact came from the assertion of socialism's inevitability. I mean, inevitable in what sense? After all, socialism or barbarism doesn't imply barbarism as possible. Are actually what Marx would have said: socialism are the ruin of the contending classes. All right. On the other hand, Marx presented here is akin to the Marx of Hal Draper. Draper's great achievement was to put Marx in the company, not so much of Hegel and his followers, not so much of Ricardo and his followers, but of the 19th century's other radical socialist and revolutionary leaders like Blanqui, Ferdinand Lassalle, and Mikhail Bakunin. For those of you who want to know that's Hal Draper's magnum opus, Karl Marx Theory of Revolution, volumes 1 through 5, which are books I really like. There are Hal Draper books I'm discovering I don't like. I am behind the Patreon wall going through War and Revolution, which is a breakdown of quote, the myth of Lenin's revolutionary defeatism. And I'm finding some of the arguments in that book to be very weak. But anyway, let's get back to this. Of course, Marx was indeed a major philosopher and an economist. Yeah. But the Marx who is central for Lenin and his generation was the one whose new view of the path to socialism gave rise to a new view of the task of the socialist, a political strategy that, in turn, inspired some of the most impressive and innovative political institution buildings of the 19th century. In 1917, in his notebooks on Marxism and the state, Lenin commented, the basic idea of Marx, the conquest of political power by the proletariat. Marx's philosopher and Marx the economist tried to give these few words the most solid foundation as possible. But the Marx who had the greatest impact on the 19th century was the activist who tried to draw out all the implications of political strategy that lay hidden in these few words. Now, I do think sometimes Lars Lee is a little bit too forgiving of Lassalle. I really thought that in Lee's discussion of the critique of the Goethe Program, which I thought parsed way too much. In the Lassalle was great. All right. In Italy at the turn of the century, we are told the Italian socialists named their sons Lasso and their daughters Marxina. Some informed observers were ready to give Ferdinand Lassalle the top billing. To Lassalle, even more than to Marx. Modern socialism is deeply indebted. In fact, it was Lassalleans who came up with the idea of democratic centralism, even though centralism and democracy are both important in Marx. It wasn't put together by Marx. It was put together by one of Lassalle's lieutenants in the SPD. Marx set the world of culture and thinking argument. Lassalle set the people organizing. And the German Social Democratic Party, Lassalle was named the hero founder, and a meeting were opened by an anthem that affirmed the Baum der Kinderen, Vogeln wir Das in Gefit Lassalle. We follow the bold path of Lassalle has led us. In these days, in contrast, Lassalle has more or less dropped off the historical radar screen. A more recent 600-page book on the history of the European left in the last 150 years does not even mention him. A direct motive for bringing out his contribution here is that Lassalle makes an appearance in the crucial passage in What is to be Done. A wider motive is the conviction that one cannot understand the emotional world of social democracy nor the logic of its institutions without looking at its forgotten founding father. But I would add, Marx called Lassalle a hero of the people, but he also hated his guts. I mean, he didn't. That's actually too simple. Marx thought Lassalle was important for organizing, but also thought Lassalle was guilty of a lot of stuff he accused the other socialists of being, including his iron laws of wages, including his willingness to comport with Bismarck. These are things that Marx had wanted nothing to do with. So I do find this part of Lars Lee to be somewhat interesting. And maybe is some of my response to some of my friends in Mug who are softer on Lassalle than I would be, or who say that the discussion of Lassalle is no longer relevant, when I think, contraire, it very much is, because it's tied into even modern non-Marxist social democrats, like kinds of MMTers who really look at Knapp seriously, because Knapp was actually pulling from Lassalle more than anything else. All right. Lassalle's career as a leader of the nascent German Social Democrat was incredibly short, given its impact on the rest of the century. In 1863, he was asked by the German worker group to give his opinion to the best political course of the worker in his open letter, also known as his manifesto. Lassalle advised him to organize an independent political party aimed at achieving universal suffrage. Then he plunged into a whirlwind round of setting up such an organized party. Only a year and a half later, at the start of his campaign, he was killed in a duel that arose out of his love affair with the German countess. His death was probably a good career move, since his organization method have retrieved little in contrast with his relations with conservatives such as Bismarck, which might soon have sorely discredited him. As it was, he remained a martyr and an icon of the cause. I mean, yeah, it's always good for you when you become a martyr for the people because you died before people realized what you were doing. But the Eisenknechters were not as large as the all German workers grouping, which became the basis of the SPD. Just a fact. Lassalle's impact on his contemporaries was large, part due to his larger than life flamboyance. The English critic George Brown, writing in 1881, declared the fundamental feature of his temperament was apparently in the quality best expressed by the Jewish word chutzpah, which connotes presence of mind, impotence, temerity, resolution, and effrontery. Lassalle's legacy to German social democracy was a pretty mixed bag indeed, and the movement spent many years shedding off many of his policy nostrums as well as his proclivities towards dictatorial party organization. Remember, I said he came up with democratic centralism, and some of the worst forms of it come from his instantiation of the term. In our discussion, however, with one important exception, we're going to focus on the permanent contribution that otherwise suspicious Marxists were prepared to grant. There were two sides to Lassalle's permanent contribution. He brought out the emotional underpinning of the merger narrative more vividly and effectively than either Marx nor Engels. He was a good orator from everything I've read. He also brought up political strategy inherent to the merger firma on a national scale for all to see. I find it really interesting about the focus on the national scale here over the international one in Lee. I find it really interesting, particularly when I compare it to points made about the ambiguities here in Lenin by people like the guy who wrote the political thought of Stalin. I gotta remember his name. Hold on. So in the work of Eric Varn, this becomes up because the ambiguities around whether or not socialism was inherently a national and international project is one of the things that comes up in Eric Varn's work, and Lenin seems to be on both sides of it. If you go back and make it sound like the primary field was national, and national parties did have to exist and did have to be primary form of organization, it does actually lead some pretty big problems later on. The emotional fervor latent in the merger formula arises most profoundly from the idea of mission, a noble task one has an obligation to accept. In the text by Marx and Lenin we have looked at, we've seen reference to Beruf, to a world-freeing deed, the great workers' great duty in their historic mission. But Marx and Engels were perhaps too sardonic to wax eloquent on this theme. Lassalle was just the opposite. With his melodramatic rhetoric was no doubt dated more than Marx, it was extremely effective at the time. 30 years later, propagandizing amongst the workers of St. Petersburg, K.M. Tararev found that Lassalle's idea of the worker state made a very strong impression on the workers in his sturdy circle. Lassalle explained the ideal of the workers' state by the following story. Originally, the workers had been unified with the bourgeoisie as part of the revolutionary third estate, but then the bourgeoisie separated itself off to its egotism and desire for privilege. For the workers, in contrast, self-interest and group solidarity can coincide. Quote, the more earnestly and deeply the lower classes of society strive after the improvement of their condition as a class, the improvement of their lot as of their class, the more distant to their personal interests as opposing the movement of history and thereby condemned to the immortality, which is simplified by the bourgeoisie, assume a direction which thoroughly accords with the development of whole people, with victory of the idea, and with the advance of culture, with the living principle of history itself, which is no other than the development of freedom, or in other words, its interest is the interest of the entire human race. The workers now constituted a fourth estate that possessed a historical mission to transform society. You are able to, therefore, to devote yourselves with a personal passion to the historical development, and to attain that more strongly this passion grows and burns within you, the higher is the moral passion which you have obtained. We congratulate ourselves, gentlemen. We have been born at a time which is destined to witness the most glorious work of history that we are permitted to take part in accomplishing. But this destiny imposes an obligation of quasi-religious earnestness, as revealed by the following widely quoted passage from one of Lassalle's most influential writings, The Worker Program. Long quote from Lassalle. Nothing is more calculated to impress upon a class a worthy and moral character than the awareness of it destined to becoming a ruling class. This almost fits the endnotes critique of the workers' movement as positing itself as a new ruling class, not an abolition of classes. And that, I think, actually the Lassalle versus Marx tension there. Lassalle is a workerist. Marx is a workerist because he sees the workers as the ability to end class society altogether. I wonder if Lee's going to talk about this here. Then the awareness of it's destined to become a ruling class, that it's called upon the race, the principle of its class, the principle of the entire age, to convert its idea to the leading idea of the whole society, and thus transformed by impression upon its character. The high and worldwide honor of this destiny must occupy all our thoughts. Neither the burning of the oppressed, nor the idle dispensation of the thoughtless, nor the harmless vulgarity of the insignificant are henceforth becoming to you. You are walking which the trench of the present is built. It is a lofty morality of earnestness of this thought which must, with devouring exclusiveness, possess your spirits, fill your mind, shape your whole lives, so as to make them worthy of it, comfortable to it, and always related to it. It is the moral earnestness of this thought that must never leave you, but must present to your heart in your workshops during the hours of labor, in your leisure hours, during your walks, at your meetings, even when you stretch your limbs to rest upon your hard couches. It is this thought which must fulfill and occupy your minds till they lose themselves in dreams. The more exclusively you immerse yourself in the moral earnestness of the thought, the more dividedly you give yourselves to its glowing fervor, and by much the more, be assured, you will hasten the time within which the present period of history will have fulfilled the task. So sooner you will bring about the accomplishment of this task. Lassalle was also remembered because he showed the path, that is, he set the fundamentals of the political party strategy. The strategy was first announced in the open letter. The working class must constitute itself an independent political party and make universal, equal, and direct suffrage the primary watchword and banner of the party. Thus, Lassalle called for independent political organization. All three terms have equal emphasis. As the Lassalle put forth this strategy, all the facets were innovative, but not to say outrageous. By insisting on political organization, Lassalle was flying in the face of an opinion wielded even among the workers themselves, as Lassalle put it in the open letter. You have no business to trouble yourself with the political movement, for this is something which you have no interest. The content of the workers' politics comes from the uplifting mission of the workers and their loyalty to the idea of the fourth estate. Lenin and what is to be done makes the distinction between trade unionist politics and social democratic politics. The essence of distinction was already in Lassalle. You want to found savings banks and valid and sick help societies, institutions whose relative but subordinate importance I readily recognize. But is it your aim to ameliorate the condition of the worker, guarding him against the results of recklessness, sickness, age, and accidents, the unguarded effects of which depress individual workers below the ordinary conditions of their class? If so, the establishments of such institutions will be fully equal to meet your aims. But for such an aim, it would hardly be worthwhile to instigate a movement throughout all of Germany and commence a universal agitation for the entire worker estate. A movement of such magnitude as a universal agitation for the working man of the nation, however, be far from finding its reward in accomplishing so little when so much could be done. Lassalle insisted on political independence, a goal which in 1861 had very concrete meaning: to break away from the liberal progressive party that to such a large extent had summoned up the workers' societies in the first place in order to recruit followers in a struggle for a liberal constitution. Now, if that doesn't sound like we're still stuck in that fucking phase, I don't know what else does. Because if anything, I mean, I'm reading this from Mugg and the DSA, and they're advocating for a breakaway from the Democratic Party. Which seems to always be almost never achieving. Like it's an incredibly popular position even out here in Salt Lake. I've heard it advocated for thoroughly in DSA meetings now in a way that I did not 5 or 6 years ago. At the same time, we seem further and further away from it because all electoral strategies still have to end with a D at the end of the name. As if the Popular Front has erased even that Lassalle thought that this was a failed strategy. Lassalle valiantly attacked the progressives because of their bourgeois interests were in conflict with those of the workers. He also attacked them because of their lack of energy, weakness, impulsivity, and fighting them for their own goal of political freedom. The sort of accusation against the liberals became a standard feature of social democracy in both Germany and Russia. Finally, Lassalle insisted on effective organization. One aspect of this theme was rather dictatorial and cult of personality mode of the inter-party organization. What I want to stress here, which I think still survives in most forms of Marxism, even though it doesn't come from Marx himself. What I want to stress here is rather how Lassalle's idea of organization followed from the fundamental aim of spreading the good news of the idea of the fourth estate. And we'll stop here for today. Protect your peace, comrades. We'll come back to this soon enough. And also, I'm going to start covering other things too. I've just been very busy, and this is a steady thing. I'm going to continue covering this for a while. We might take some brief breaks, but I'm going to start adding other things for radical engagement. So it's not only going to be this Marxist Unity Group reader for like a year and a half. Don't worry.